Hi Bethlehem, this is Pastor Paul. We're in this sermon series entitled Making Change as we examine the ways that God takes initiative to bring change into this world to align the world with His will. Last week we looked at creation and how God brought order to the chaos and disorder of the universe. And the last step of creation was the creation of human beings, male and female, in the likeness of God. What that means is that God created us to rule alongside of Him, to rule with His wisdom and His love, to demonstrate His character. But human beings, specifically Adam and Eve, chose not to do that. They chose to rule according to their wisdom, to define good and evil on their own terms. And what we read in chapters 3 through 11 of Genesis is how the world descends back into a state of disorder and of chaos. We see that in that final story of Genesis chapter 11 with the story of the Tower of Babel. And then things begin to change in Genesis chapter 12 as God chooses a man named Abram. And He makes a great promise to Abram. He says that He will bless Abraham, and that through Abraham and his descendants, that God will bless all the nations of the world. And so Abram follows God, he trusts God, and he goes to the promised land. But even though it's many years later, Abram still doesn't have any descendants. He cries out to God and says, hey, I'm going to have to make one of my servants an heir because I have no children. And God says, no, I have made you a promise. And to seal that promise, I am making a covenant with you. A covenant is a solemn promise, usually ratified in blood, in the blood of a sacrifice, in the killing of an animal. And so God asks Abram to cut animals in half and to separate them so that there's an alley, a lane down between the halves. And in this way, what God is saying is that if the covenant goes unfulfilled, those who do not fulfill it should be killed, cut in half, just like these animals. But a strange thing happens. At night, God walks through the halves. Abraham does not. In this, God is saying, this promise is so important, I'm going to make sure that it's fulfilled. Regardless of what Abraham does, regardless of what Abraham's descendants do, God is going to keep this promise. He is going to make sure that all the nations of the world are blessed through Abraham. And so we read through the rest of Genesis how about Abraham's descendants of Isaac and Jacob and all of Jacob's sons, and how they go into slavery in Egypt, and how God delivers them out of slavery in Exodus, and how He brings them to Mount Sinai and extends this covenant with them and says, hey, I am going to do this for you. This promise I made to Abraham, I'm going to fulfill through you. And in Exodus chapter 20, we read about the terms of this covenant, what we call the Ten Commandments. They are to follow these things, to keep the covenant. But Israel doesn't. And so much of the rest of the Old Testament deals with how Israel forgets the covenant and doesn't obey the covenant. And the prophets call Israel back to obey the covenant. And then you get to Luke chapter 1, and Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, says, it's happened. God has remembered His covenant. He is going to fulfill it through Jesus. And Jesus is born. Jesus is the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. It's through Jesus that God will bless all the nations of the world. And so our big idea is that we follow God's example when we initiate change to bless those around us. We follow God's example when we initiate change to bless those around us. Our challenge is to bless somebody this week. Go out of your way to bless someone who is in need. My other ask of you this week is I invite you to join me in praying every morning for the next 30 days until our society meeting, that God would unite us as a church and that he would keep us from the attacks of the enemy. Thanks for listening, Bethlehem. I hope to see you Good Friday at 7 o'clock for our Good Friday service, and on Easter Sunday morning at 10:30. God bless.